So the promotion square of the pawn is a1, and this position is winning for white no matter what. So try to find a win for white if white moves first and if black moves first. So this is a very special case where the king and the knight is able to checkmate the black king in the corner. And you're welcome to put in your suggestions in the chat. I will see that and respond to it. Yeah, so for those of you who came in just now, this is a position that's winning for white. This is the promotion square of the black pawn, a1. And if black moves first, then white can checkmate the black king in the corner. And this is also the case if white moves first. But it's two different checkmates. Yeah, Matt, you got it right. So we're going to do that a lot today. Consider positions where white is to move and then ask the question, what if black is to move? Because we're going to see what if it's the opponent's move. How do we lose a tempo? How do we win a tempo? How do we deal with a position if it's not our move? Because the knight is not very good at making waiting moves. So we will look at ways to find a solution in other ways. And this is a good way, white to move, black to move first. And as you will see in this first hour, actually both hours here, is that the knight is able to find surprising solutions to many of these positions, even though you hand over the move to the opponent. So the knight can somehow get around this problem that it's not very good at making waiting moves. So that's what we're trying to do today. A lot of different positions, fun positions, I believe. Yeah, Bora, you got it too. So before we get the solutions to this one, let me just unshare for a moment and let's get the plan for today up. It looks roughly like this. So knight versus pawns, how the knight loses a tempo. And that's a provocative statement because the knight cannot really lose a tempo itself. But as you will see later, there's much more to this point. So the first one is king and knight mates. We will look at a few examples. And there will also be some in the puzzles. Knight on the other side, I will explain that to you. But if you have two blocked pawns and you put the knight on the other side of those pawns defending your pawn, then it's very hard for the king to get closer to that knight. So that's a way to defend the pawn by just jumping on the other side. King movements, and one that everyone knows is king triangulation, where you're losing or winning a tempo depending how you see it. And then there's the position of mutual zugzwang and how we can deal with that. That's kind of like the same idea. And then in many of those positions, we will look at from white to move, black to move. And then in the end, we will also look at other tools. So there are other tools that adds to the knight's flexibility and being able to solve different kinds of problems, even though we cannot make waiting moves. So the knight can do other things. And so there's a barrier. The knight can sometimes be sacrificed to win time. And then we can put the knight behind our own pawn. So if the king takes the knight, then the pawn runs off the board. So these are all tools we will see throughout the next couple of hours in the presentation and in the puzzles. Okay, let's get to it. Let's get back to our position. So, white to move first. And here we have check. And because we protect this a2 square, we force black to move the pawn forward. Otherwise, he would like to go back with the king. And then we have a checkmate. So the idea is to control this a2 square, and then we can force the pawn forward, and then we can checkmate. If black moves first, king a1, then we can play knight c1, and then we do the same thing. We control this square, and we are ready to checkmate on b3. So either we came from b4 or we came from c1. So these two ideas are very important. And suddenly, because there are two different ideas in the position, it doesn't matter if it's white or black that moves first. So that's kind of an important point. So let's try with this in mind. Let's try to take the next position. So there's, among studies and other positions, there's quite a few of these where the kings end up being trapped in the corner, and then so the pawn has to be on h3. If it's on h4, then usually the king can run out. But this setup here, and the black king is getting mated in corner, is, yeah, it's a favorite theme for many endgame study composers. But it also happens in, next week we're going to look a little bit at two knights versus pawn, and it actually also happens here in some positions. So it's more common than you might think. So let's see, how can white win this? White to move and win. And you may also consider, what if black moves first? And then we can ask ourselves, where did that tempo go? Because white wins in either case. White is going to win here. So which of the two mates are we going for here? And how do we do it? If you see the solution, you're welcome to put it in the chat. Otherwise, I will go ahead. So knight f6. And now black can play something like, if he plays g5, then we have this check. And now we're using one of the methods, forcing this, and then we can checkmate. Yeah, that's what I got. So instead of g5, king h1 might be a better defense. Oh, it might actually lead to the same. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a switch of move order. Okay, so what if black moves first? Yeah. So let's see. If he plays g5, then we could play knight f6. Knight takes g4. And then this leads to the same kind of mate. So let's see if black can defend a little bit better here. What if I move the king down here? And then I can maybe move the king back. Let's see, check. So how do we deal with the position? Oh, now we can play king f1 and then. Yeah, this is not so easy, right? Because now we get into this position and suddenly we would like it to be black's move here, because then black would have to play h2 and then we can checkmate here. So how do we deal with this? Now black started out. Now we cannot make the same waiting move as we did before. And this is where the two basic solutions we had, this is where they come in handy, because playing the knight here checkmate is one way to do it. And if you remember, the other one was going to the f1 square and then checkmating on g3. So now we have to use our full range of options. So how do we do this? Knight e3. Three options. Maybe it's easier to do like this. Yeah. So if g4 now, we have our first mate. Okay. So instead of g4, I can also go king h1. Then I can go back here, force you to play h2. And then we can use the other idea. Knight takes g3. So here's the question. This was the other mate. Where did that tempo, extra tempo go? It somehow disappeared. So even though black started out in this position, white was able to mate anyway. So you could say, yeah, that's because white has two options. But in many of the other themes we're going to talk about, it seems like white has two options there too. So that gives certain flexibility with two different ways of solving the problem. So you could also say that, well, if the pawn is there or there, that doesn't really matter because I'm going to mate anywhere. So the tempo disappears somewhere in here when the pawn moves forward. So maybe a clearer example is maybe if when white starts out the position, plays knight f6, and then here. And then it doesn't really matter where this pawn is because the knight could also have taken this pawn. So if the pawn is somewhere here, now I have to be careful what I'm saying. Here. Yeah, so it's kind of like the tempo disappears along the G file because the pawn has to move forward and somehow G4, G3, the knight ends on G3 anyway, the knight ends on G4 anyway. So the tempo somehow disappears somewhere in there. But I think the main reason is that white has two different options, which gives some flexibility. Let's try the next position. Okay, so this is a slightly more advanced example. And so the knight is starting out on a slightly awkward square, f3. So there is only one correct first move because we have to get into a position where we can easily get to g4, f2. or f1 to g3. So now we have to make sure we move the knight around in the right way. And the right first move is, yeah, knight e5. So then we can jump to g4 and something like this. And if now, let's take the main line, f3, check. Now h2 leads to mate, so f2. And I like this example because h2 was made immediately with method number 1. And now after f2, white has to switch to method 2. Is it knight e4? We have to make sure the black king does not run out. And then we have to make sure that every time black tries to stalemate himself, we have a checkmate on g3. So we cannot leave the g3 square out of sight. And now it's all about getting the knight to the f1 square to force the pawn forward and checkmate on g3. So this is how we do it. So in this puzzle, you have method 1 and 2 combined. So let's try to go back from the start. So knight e5. And then here we looked at f3. Let's look at king h1. But it's basically going to be the same thing. We get into the same position. And then we just have to transfer that knight to f1. So again, 2 methods of mating gives white flexibility, and somehow he can deal with this. So what happens if black moves first here? Let's see that. And this is a case where the tempo disappears somewhere in here, f3, f2. Because it doesn't matter if the pawn is on f3 and we mate on f2, or the pawn actually moves to f2 and we take it and mate. So the tempo disappears around here. So this is actually easier. There's only one move now. And then we just need to get our knight to f2. Like this. So that's how that goes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep, let's move on. So here's a case of knight on the other side. And for this puzzle, there is one, we're going to do this now, but then in one of the puzzles, that is number 3, you will get the position if black moves first and black plays king to d5. So let's take it with white moves first. And the winning idea is so black is trying to get in here, kick the knight away, and trying to get to the white pawn. So, and the white king is far away, so it doesn't seem so easy. But once you get the idea, b4 is a very strong move. Just blocking these 2 pawns. Yeah, and then we're aiming for knight on the other side. So let's say king moves forward to attack the pawn, and then we just jump on the other side. So now it takes the king a lot of moves to kick that knight away, and then we just jump back. And then the king spends a lot of moves going back, and then we can just go back to a6. So in the meantime, we can bring our king in. So this is winning easily. Mm-hmm. But so in the puzzles, we will look at the position after king d5. So black moves first. So an important point in this knight on the other side is I can move my knight to a6, and then the knight is on the other side of this pawn. But unless it's a rook's pawn, there will always be two options to jump on the other side. And it would actually work on c6 too, if the king was not directly attacking it. So, so if you imagine a situation where if this knight was on c6, for instance, and black played the king back, then we could jump the knight to a5, and we would still, and black would have to spend all this time trying to attack, and then we could just jump back to c6. So the point is that with this idea of knight on the other side, we again have two different solutions. We can go to c6 and we can go to a6. And because we have these two options, we can kind of deal with, let's say, who's to move, other factors in the position. And I will show you the next example that makes it's a little more complicated, but then somehow the knight finds a way, not yet. Somehow the knight finds a way on the open board. Let's take this one first. So, white to move and win. So any good ideas how to win this with white? Black is going down the board, so this is the promotion square of the pawn, a1. Black's idea is, of course, to try to attack this pawn, and that hope that his a pawn will be a diversion so that he can maybe get over here and draw. And if the white king maybe tries to get to the king side, then maybe the black king can keep chasing the knight around and not allowing it to sacrifice itself on the a4 pawn, and that would then be a draw. So I believe a move like knight a3 has the flaw that I could try to attack the pawn and then I could run back, and the moment when I play king b2, we end up in a situation where I can keep attacking your knight, and I won't let you sacrifice the knight on the a pawn. We can try to have a look. Let me see. I'm not sure. Should I move to king c1 first, or should I try to e1? So we can try this just to see it. Let's see. Okay, you got the pawn, but then I start chasing your knight. So do you want to jump to b5 to gain some time? Yeah, I thought so. Let's say king f4. Yeah, then you have knight d4, and then you can get the king closer. I agree. That is starting to look good. Let me see. King e4, king e3. I'm not sure. But is this winning for white? I mean, you have to. I'm threatening to take the knight in the corner, but then maybe you can get your king back to, let's say, something like this. Yeah, you're not in time to play knight c2. g4 here. So this looks like a draw. Now you have to stalemate me, I guess. Otherwise, I promote first. So I just want to. So these are general ideas. I just want to make sure that everything I said was. So let's look at the position after knight a3. I just want to make sure we didn't do anything wrong. So I'll just ask the engine. So let's see, king e1, king e3. Yeah, so the idea is, there's a lot of details, but once we get to this position, and that's the main idea, then we can keep attacking that knight. We simply won't allow the knight to, okay, knight, so king b4 was wrong. I should have played king c4. So that's why I always check with the computer, because little details like this. Now there's no knight d4. Just to see the trickery of the knight, let's see what we missed. King e3 is the right one. Then maybe we do get to closer to play knight c2. Let's see. That might be a big difference. Yeah, now we can play king d2. Yeah, okay. And now it's easily winning. So we could get to the d2 square instead of king e4. But black should have played king c4. So the point is not to go into deep detail with this kind of position. And knight engagements can be very complicated. Instead of knight a3, there's another idea. And the idea is that we let the knight defend this pawn. We can go on the other side because the king is actually in reach of this pawn. If black plays a3, we have king c3. So the idea is simply to get the knight on the other side of this pawn. So it's actually quite a simple idea once you spot it. So a3 and then king c3, and we will take the pawn, and the knight will make sure that the g2 pawn is defended. So king e1. And now it's all simple. The king is going for this pawn. And whenever you try to attack my knight, I just jump back to f3, and then I'm ready to jump back here in h4 again. And here we have the same point that actually both f4 and h4 works depending on circumstances. Let's take a few more moves. Let's say the knight was on f4 and black played king e3. Then we could jump to h3, and then black would take a long time maybe to get around to the pawn, then we could just play back to f4. So again, two options for the knight, f4, h4, which gives a certain kind of flexibility. So this is the winning idea, bring the knight to h4. So let's go for the next example. So this one is black to move and win. So we have the promotion squares of the white pawn. So white is going up the board as usual. So it's black to move and win. And here we use the idea of knight on the other side. I think this is actually a very good example of what happens how this tempo is won or lost, whatever. So to win this position, so let's see, knight c4. So black activates the knight, and the knight is still controlling the pawn. Okay, white has nothing better than king g4. But then we have a knight check here. And we can play knight g2, knight on the other side. And now the king is inside the square of this pawn. So if a5, then king d5. King goes for the pawn. And the knight can make sure that this pawn is safe by jumping on the other side. So if white tries something like king g4, king h3, we just jump on the other side. Yeah. That is a nice wall. I use the word wall because barrier kind of refers to the thing the knight does when it protects the actual squares, and then the indirectly, and that creates a wall. That's the barrier. This was more like a wall because just making this wall of, because they directly control those squares. Anyway, so that's the point. We were able to, and the same would work both on E2 and G2 under different circumstances. And then the king simply goes for the pawn. So, okay, so here comes the big question. What if white moves first? So how do we deal with that? Because now we have the problem. If we bring the knight into c4, let's say, king g5, then knight e3 is not a check. And then if we play knight d2 and the king defends the pawn, then the knight loses sight of this a4 pawn. So it seems like because white moves first, black is somehow lacking a tempo, and the king cannot make any helping movements because it has to stay defending that f4 pawn. So how does black lose that tempo here in this position? So before we ended up putting the knight on g2, and in this position we are aiming for the e2 square. And then in the end, the tempo doesn't matter because we have these two options. So in this position, we go knight b3 first. And white doesn't have anything better than king g5. Yeah, that is right. So now we get a tempo on the f pawn. That's another way of putting it. So knight to d4. There might be another option than this, but this is very clear. Even if you play a5 now, I could take with check and I could just bring the knight back. So, I mean, that's even an option I have now. Now it's just an easy win. Yeah, because then I can always make a waiting move in front of a pawn. So we don't have problems with waiting moves there. So after knight d4, king goes back to g4. And now we have knight on the other side. And we can go for the pawn with the king. So it seems like there were a couple of solutions there, and then we could adjust. So the knight is often able to do this even on an open board, and then somehow that extra tempo disappears, which is very interesting. Okay, let's see. Let's move on. That was the position with white moves first. Okay. Okay, now we come to a couple of positions where white has an H pawn and black has either an A pawn or C pawn, or maybe even a B pawn. There's a pawn over here so that the knight has to be far away on the queen side. So if the knight wants to help the king and pawn support this pawn and the promotion square up here, it's going to be far away from the queen side. So let's look at those. And there's one of the puzzles is, that's number 4, is with these kinds of positions. So the first idea is when knight is finding one pawn, if we have a chance to jump on the other side of the pawn, then we can take it. And that actually gives us time, make sure we're actually able to sacrifice the knight on the pawn. So as we saw in the previous example, sometimes if it's an A pawn or B pawn, let's say, then there is no other side for the knight. So the knight is not able to sacrifice itself. But that is suddenly the the case with a bishop and central pawn. So you take the king along. I can't even go to d3 because then you just knight b4 check and pick up the pawn. So it would take me such a long time to try to get out, and then the knight can just jump on the other side. So so this is almost guaranteed that if white wants to sacrifice his knight for the pawn, then it's able to do it. So there is no better thing for black now to try to run down home to the corner. So it could be something like this. Let's say. So this is not such an easy position to win. Yeah, so you can put in the chat. So how do we do this? How do we win here with white? Yeah, so we can, first we can, yeah, we have to let the, yeah, first we reposition the knight to d3. I'm trying to stretch the knight. So now this is the best we can do. So the knight is closer here and is still controlling c1. And I just want to, before we go into the last part, which is the part where it becomes sharp and we let black promote, let's just go back for a moment and see that the moment here with black, I had to choose between two moves here. And the reason I chose g8 was that if I go to h8 and we get to the same kind of position as before, I don't want my king on g8 in this position, because then you can check me. I don't want this check to happen. I have to go to the corner. And now it's easy to see there's going to be a checkmate on f7. So, so with black, you have to calculate a little bit in this position. Make sure you put the king on the right square. So the most challenging for white is king g8. And how does the final part of this position go? This is actually a position from I used in sharp endgames, because you build up and then there comes this moment where you have to change the direction of position. It becomes sharp. It's a little bit unpleasant. I have to let black promote, and so the character of the position changes. But okay, knight e5, c1, knight f7 check, h7, and where is the mate? On which square do we mate? There's a mate in two moves. Yep. That's great. So the point of this position is, yeah, we can take it as far as, so king g8 was the best defense, but I was also winning after king h8. So it basically means that against the c2 pawns, c2 pawn like this, my king on c1 is close enough. So it doesn't matter who's to move. So the tempo here doesn't matter. King g8 is a better defense, but in the end it doesn't matter. Okay. So let's try to have a look at the next position. So it's black to move in this position, and black is going down the board, of course. So All these are promotion squares. And in this position, black actually made a big mistake by playing a3. He should have kept that pawn, because now we get into position like this where the knight is close enough to the king side. And let's say something like this happened. And now white is ready to let go. So this is essentially the position we had from before. But black has an extra pawn here that doesn't really matter much. And it's all the same. So a3 was definitely not the move. So black should keep that pawn. So c3 is the right move. And let's take, and then a3. Take a few more moves. Okay, king a7. And here with black, you have to choose. Do you want to go to g8 or h8? Try to think a little bit about that. And then imagine you're black trying to defend this. Which square to go to? It's very important you choose correctly here, because one move you draw, the other one you get mated. Or allow white to queen. Yep. Bora, you're correct. What's your main reason for that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I will show it in just a minute. I'll give people a chance to put in the chat. So the rest of you, G8 or H8? It's your game. Clock is ticking down. What would you play with black? All right. So Spencer, what's your idea behind that move? Yeah, you're right. So Matt, you found the right one. This is the opposite of what you're suggesting. Yeah, so this idea of knight d5, knight f6 is not dangerous, because then black king can just hide on h8. So and the knight on f6 cannot check the king on h8. So the knight is definitely going to f7, because we need to control the promotion square. So that's not so dangerous. Okay, so the correct move is king g8. Yeah, but these knight checks, they are not so dangerous if I just go to the corner. Not even c6, e7. Or you can keep checking, but we're talking about white winning if black chooses the wrong square. So king g8 is correct, as some of you point out, because here there's no check. And if there's no check, then we cannot force the king to the corner, and then we cannot mate on f7. So it's about avoid getting mated. The knight is perfect here. It's ready to go. So so there's a difference between an A pawn and a C pawn. And this pawn here is going to control the HH square. So that's the difference. So it's really tricky. So let's choose wrong first. So king h8 is wrong because in this position we can play check. And you cannot allow me to promote. And in this position, it makes no difference that the queen controls the corner square because we're getting checkmated. So it's very important to go to g8. And now there's no check. And now if white tries something like, it's actually horrible. I think actually white is losing here. Yeah, because now the queen controls the corner square, and if you do something like this, then black is winning. So white has to be content with a draw and cannot play knight c6. Then we can just take a draw. As long as black makes sure that he goes to the right square. I mean, white can try a few things here. Try to triangulate, whatever. And then in a position like this, you could even try to move the knight back here just to test black if he goes to the right square or the wrong square, depending on the circumstances. I mean, you can try a couple of moves, but if black chooses correct here, then he will make the draw. Okay. So the puzzle number 4 there is a little bit tricky. So you have to think there's something, yeah, you can have a look at that. But it's based on the two positions I've just shown you. So let me just see. Yeah, we can take this position. Here we have a position where if black moves first, he can play king g2 and it's a draw. So it's not really about move order in that sense. If black moved first and black played h3, white would be winning that position. Why is that? Let's just take that. Just a quick question. So in this position, black plays h3. White would be winning. Yeah. So it makes a big difference if the pawn is here or here. Now, after black played h3, white is winning because he doesn't actually need to care about this pawn. He can sacrifice it and keep the black king trapped in the corner. And then we had these two mating methods we saw at the beginning. So if you're black, you don't want to play h3, that makes it easier for white. White moves first has to work a little bit to win this. So the move is h3. And let's see king g3, knight g5, king f4. Knight jumps to e4. Now the king cannot go to g3. We can go to f3. King f4, king d4. So this is not such an easy position to win. But there is one method we can use here. So how does white win this now? What is the winning idea? Yeah. You got the right idea. Boro, this is exactly where the knight is going. We need to go to a certain square with a knight to win this. So the idea is we put the knight behind the pawn, and then the pawn is not lost. And when the king goes for the knight, we can go for the h4 pawn. So the square I'm talking about here is g1. We have to get to g1 in a way that we also prevent the black king from entering g3. So it has to be from e2. So let's see, knight c3. Check. And how should the white king approach the black pawn? White can still go wrong here. And so in sharp endgames, I have 16 parameters, and one of them is king movements. And when you move the king across the board, it's actually not so easy as it might sound. So you're trying to do it the right way. Yeah, you have to go via f3. So let's say here, it's actually very important we go to f3 now. So it's like we are body checking the black king while approaching the g4 square. We have to keep the black king out. And now something like this, king g5, and white is winning. If we don't go to here, this was a mistake, king f4. Then suddenly it's a draw after king f4. So yeah, king h4 is in prison. Yeah, so king to f3. Nice idea. So let's try maybe the last one. Let me see. Okay, so this example is yeah, it's very interesting. So it's actually, this one depends on who moves first, but for different reasons, I would say. So if white moves first, we can go king f2. And this is a problem for black, because black's defense relies on this knight being tied down to this pawn. So if we start to move the king away, let's say, then I can just play something like knight g2, like king g3, and I have a free knight and I'm winning easily. So black could play g5, but then we have the pawn exactly where we want them, because now they are blocked. So now that gives us extra options. So let's say g5, king e2, king d2. And now let's say if king f4, something like this, then we can sacrifice the knight like this, leave the knight behind. And if the pawn had been here, this would have been a draw, because we could play king f3. I will show that afterwards. But now it's winning for white. Before we get to that, I have a question to this position. So we looked at king f4. What would you play for white if I played king d4 and tried to keep the white king out? How would you win this with white? Yeah. So Emmanuel, what's your next move after that? Yeah, so that is exactly the right idea. We talked about it earlier. Now we have freedom to move the knight, and we can move it on the other side. Simply knight f5, knight h6. That gives us all the time in the world to bring the king in. So that's the winning idea. Now we will find a way in with the white king. That's not a problem. Okay. So that is if white moves first. So black moves first, can play king to g3. So this is a very common idea. So black has to prevent the white king from coming in and defending the pawn. If that happens, then white has a free knight, and then white is winning. Can start to maneuver that knight around. So now white can try all kinds of tricks like this. But he's not getting anywhere. The moment if he tries to sacrifice the knight here, now it doesn't work. And now the best thing he can do is probably to take the g6 pawn and then go for the draw. But something like this is just losing. So, yeah. So that was what I wanted to present to you. And now you are ready to go off with the puzzles. So, so let me just end here, and then we'll see each other at 8:30. Okay, see you then.